I'm Jeff Fritz with SoundStage.com, and I'm joined today by Lawrence Dickey. He is the Technical Director of Vivid Audio. Lawrence, how are you today?
Yeah, all good. Thanks very much, Jeff.
Well, I appreciate you joining me today, and really this is an interview that was set up for a very specific reason, and I want to kind of explain that before we get into the questions with Lawrence. So I have a review, an upcoming review of the Gryphon Apex flagship stereo amplifier. It'll be hopefully the first review in North America, maybe the first review in the world. And setting up this review, it caused me to really examine the reference system in which I was going to assess the Gryphon amplifier. And for those of you that don't know Gryphon amplifiers, one area in which their sound reproduction is perhaps better than any other is in the bass. And so looking at the speakers that I have on hand and potentially had coming in for review, I saw a little bit of a deficiency in the very, very lowest bass. So I wanted to get a speaker in that I could use to assess the Gryphon amplifier's bass. So obviously I needed something with equal or even perhaps even more adept characteristics in the bass than the Gryphon amplifier itself. The one speaker that came to mind was the Vivid Gia G1 Spirit, and that is because its bass reproduction is just, it's out of this world. And I think it's a characteristic that cuts across all Vivid speakers. I think it is probably most true in the G1 and the G1 Spirit. But so that is kind of the launching point, Lawrence. I wanted to talk about Vivid bass today. What makes Vivid Audio's bass reproduction in your loudspeakers so incredibly phenomenal?
Cool. Well, thanks very much. That's very flattering of you to say so. As it happens, I put great store on having a fast and accurate bass, but then I have a similar attitude to the whole spectrum. Sometimes I wonder whether the bottom end is a side of loudspeakers that is perhaps given less attention than it's due, or perhaps people concentrate on qualities that I'm not so bothered about. But to launch into my philosophies on bass, really it goes right back to the beginning of Vivid Audio, when my first step was to have a long linear electromagnetic shove, as we call it, or the BL factor, which means that wherever the coil is in the magnetic gap, it receives the same force for a given current. So it's very linear, but it's also important that it's a long throw. I think that's really, you hear when the bottom end is being throttled, when you get a big deep bass note which makes the coil move a long way, and then other notes come in above it and they're modulated, and that actually is quite an audible distortion. So it's always been important to me to have a long throw. The next innovative step was to use radial magnets, but unlike many, we use radial magnets where the magnets are actually immediately adjacent to the voice coil. And the importance of that is that because magnetic material, like the neodymium magnets you see here, effectively, as far as an alternating current are concerned, behave like free air. It's like having a huge air gap around the voice coil, which again reduces inductance, reduces modulation, improves linearity, all excellent qualities. The real big factor, though, which was an invention we used first on the G1, the original G1, but subsequently on all Vivid products, certainly all the Gear series, was to exploit the quality of the exponential tube absorber. Now, this was something that we'd already used on our mid and high frequency drivers in our very first B1 and K1 products. And I can demonstrate the principle of this thing very easily. This is an exponential tube absorber. So within this tube, you have, as you'd expect, an exponentially tapered tube, but it's filled with wool with gradually increasing density as you get thinner and thinner. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to talk into this tube, and hopefully you can hear the end-to-end resonances. And when I add this absorber, you can hear that the resonance has just disappeared, because this tube terminates the absorber terminates the tube so very perfectly. The original B1 and K1, however, were in many ways just an ordinary bass reflex. When it came to G1, I really wanted to improve on that standard loading, and I wanted to combine the benefits of the exponential tube with the bass reflex. But in previous experiments, which I had tried, we usually found that adding the exponential tube damped the port output. The thing about G1 was I realized that if you chose the cutoff frequency of the exponential tube appropriately, you could actually get the best of both worlds. Now, I have a little demo here. So this musical instrument, which looks as though it should be for perhaps charming a snake out of a wicker basket, is a little model of a Helmholtz resonator, which of course is the principle behind a bass reflex enclosure. So what I've got here is what's known as a fipple, like a recorder. And here you have a chamber. What I'm going to do first is to just put my hand over the end, and this will behave like an ordinary reflex loudspeaker. So I'll just blow in it gently, and then I'll blow in it hard, and you'll hear how I excite the overtones. So that's fundamental. So you can hear those overtones. Now, when I add this exponential absorber, you've still got the fundamental. Oops, got a leak. But when I blow harder, there's a fundamental. You hear that the harmonics have virtually disappeared. That principle is used to great effect in the gear series. I think that's the single most important factor. By removing the top to bottom cabinet resonances, while still having a nice clean port output, I think that gives us something which really is quite unique. Having achieved a well-behaved response of the driver in the cabinet, there are still other improvements that you can make. One of the signature technologies of Vivid Audio, although it's not unique, there are a few others, is to use reaction cancelling bass drivers and reaction cancelling ports. Now, the thing about reaction cancelling is that because you have opposing drivers, it balances out the forces, the reaction forces in the cabinet. It means that the cabinet can remain absolutely still, no matter what level of bass you put through it. And importantly, that means that the cabinet can be light and stiff, which again, in the world of resonances, means that you can push the resonances, the structural resonances of the cabinet right out of band, which I think is, again, very important. So a well-behaved airspace, well-behaved structure. What other factors? Well, I personally believe that it's important to have a generous BL factor, and the way in which I actually design the crossover is also quite important. I think taking into account the impedance of the driver and the design of the crossover is crucial. And then, of course, the use of things like air cord inductors and non-polar or metallized film capacitors all the way through, all important factors are perhaps diminishing significance, but still, when you put the whole package together, what you end up with is a really well-behaved filter response. Whereas so very often when you actually measure real practical loudspeakers, they'll have quite often a bump in the response at 70 to 90 hertz, which sounds fun. It's great with rock, but it ain't accurate. And I think one of the things about Vivid is that we do try to have fast, accurate bass. And I think I've given you there an outline of what I believe to be the crucial ingredients.
So those ingredients, just to try to recap a little bit, first of all, you mentioned the throw of the driver. So they're long throw drivers, and I'm not sure if it's causation and correlation, as far as what I hear, but certainly it sounds like, when you listen to a G1, you just hear this immediate slam. There's when the bass calls for it, there's just tremendous weight and punch. And that seems like that would be something that generous throw that you mentioned would, that there would be some that would be the cause or of that. Would you say that's true?
I think that the generous throw gives that effortless quality.
Okay.
But I would say the slam is more due to the excellent phase response, which is a result of the well-behaved characteristics, and of course the lack of coloration.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the lack of cabinet resonances due to the reaction canceling opposing drivers. That just seems like a no-brainer that loudspeaker designers and engineers would use. But you guys obviously use it to great effect in the Gia as well. So you don't hear the cabinet per se, and then it enables you to build a more efficient, cost-effective cabinet as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, I mean, our primary thing isn't particularly the cost effectiveness, but it is to, to do what's necessary to get those resonances out of band.
And then the what you mentioned with the exponential horn loading of the driver, and obviously that it's a form following function in the Gia loudspeaker range. You can see why that's the case. But in terms of the ports for the bass loading, it never really occurred to me that that's something that you use down low in the bass frequencies, and you're able to get that port response that is just clean and really adds to the bass without detracting with all of those unwanted noises that we've all heard from ported loudspeakers in the past.
Yeah, actually, you've just reminded me of another thing which I didn't mention in my little list is the aerodynamic design of the ports. At that port tuning, where all the sound is actually being generated by the air rushing in and out of the port, it's quite important that the air does move smoothly. So when you've just got a piece of rough cardboard tube with sharp edges, inevitably you end up with a sort of noise. Mm-hmm. If you flare it aerodynamically, it does help. It's all these little steps which all help.
Yeah, and then lastly, you mentioned the crossover and the crossover components and the way that you design the crossover. So I guess the long and the short of it is that Vivid Bass is not. There's not one thing. There's one really super important thing, but then you just have this collection of technologies and design traits that all act together to just produce this excellent bass response. And would you say, and this is maybe a softball question, but would you say that is most evident in the Gia series, or do you have that at least to some degree, those collection of design traits in the other loudspeakers?
It's one of those things that having done it, we can't go back. And that even if I were to redesign, for instance, I don't know, the B1, our first loudspeaker, I'd put an exponential horn inside it now because it really works. And do you know what? It's actually quite simple.
No, that's terrific. Well, Lawrence, I really appreciate it. I have to just tell everyone that's watching, I'm due to get a pair of G1 Spirits in, and I'm going to write about those as well as the Gryphon Apex, and then I'm going to write about them in conjunction with each other because they're I'm hoping that there'll be a synergistic match. I feel like they will. But the G1 Spirit, it certainly deserves another look. And just so that everyone knows, I moved into a new room about 4 years ago this summer. I did have G1 Spirits in my last home and my last listening room, but I've not had a pair in this listening room, and I just can't wait to get those in and just to take a fresh listen to those loudspeakers in this acoustic space that is my listening room right now. And I just really appreciate, Lawrence, the technical description. I tried to kind of summarize and translate, but not nearly as eloquent as you. You have a gift to explain these engineering design traits, and I really appreciate as well the demonstrations, because you could clearly hear that. And then if you put it into a large loudspeaker, you can imagine why not having those technologies in there would lead to some sonic chaos.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, Lawrence, thank you so
Okay.
much for today. I really appreciate it, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks for giving me the chance to give that explanation. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.